Today we'll be talking about my favorite ship that came out in the current update. That is the Tier 8 German tech tree destroyer Felix Schultz, which is really fun to play, if I'm being honest. I'll start off by showing you my commander build, and note that this build is not really specifically designed for the Schultz, or really the entire line that precedes it. It's specially tailored for the Elbing, which is also a Tier 8 German destroyer and quite similar to the Schultz. You'll see we've got the inspirations of Anton Gurin for extra AP pen and the Decepticon Rumble for even increased gun range, which may not necessarily be necessary on the Schultz. I'm going to run down the stats, talk about how the ship plays, and whether I think it's worth grinding to. Spoiler alert, I do. But to begin with, we'll start with the HP, and keep in mind that all of these numbers that I read you are influenced by my commander build and my module selection. I am using the Epic Reload mod in the 4th slot, which allows us to gain even faster reload for every 30,000 damage we do. In any case, though, the Schultz has 29,040 HP, nearly 30k. I suppose you could buff that if you wanted to by adding William Sims as an inspiration instead of somebody like Gurin, and that would certainly be fine, but 29k is more than enough. The Schultz, in addition to having this high HP pool, also gets a gimmick that is unique to this destroyer line. The Merker also has it at Tier 7. The Elbing has it at Tier 8 along with the Schultz, and that is a 25mm armor plate midship. Basically, almost a Citadel-like armor scheme. You can see it in the armor viewer. That 25mm might not sound like a lot, but it is significant for one crucial reason. And that reason is most destroyers, actually every destroyer that doesn't have guns that are 150mm, every destroyer is going to shatter its HE on that 25mm plating. So if you run into something like, say, a Sumner at Tier 8, which has 127mm guns, and it shoots your 25mm armor plate, it will get 0 damage. All of its shells will shatter. In order to effectively damage the Schultz, the Elbing, the Merker, if you're playing against them in another destroyer, they're giving you flat broadside, you'll notice that all your HE is shattering. That should be your clue to immediately switch to armor piercing, because that will penetrate the 25mm plate so long as it's not angled, and it will likely get full penetrations, which will deal more damage than even the HE will. So if you run up against one of these new German destroyers, be sure to shoot AP at its flat broadside, otherwise you will be wasting your time and it will kill you, because its AP is actually quite effective against destroyers. So that's it for survivability, really. Let's move on to the guns, which are absolutely the highlight of this particular destroyer. There are 6 of them, and they are cruiser caliber guns, 150mm. That's essentially light cruiser caliber, and they feel like cruiser guns. Now, the HE is not really the main selling point of these guns, but it does have very good damage. But note, with my Eric Bai build, I am using the mortar skill, which gives me a 13% damage buff on both high explosive and armor piercing. So these numbers include that damage buff. But for our HE, we've got a maximum damage of 2,034 with a 12% fire chance. And for the AP, the maximum damage is 4,520. The guns reload in 5.5 seconds with the reload mod, and that time decreases with the more damage we do if we're running the epic version of that mod, which we are right now. I don't know if we were in this game. We might not have been, but we are now. And then the gun range with Rumble as an inspiration, and with the skill on Bay's Tree that also increases main battery range and decreases reload, along with the epic booster of Battle Propensity Flag, we achieve a maximum gun range of 14.5 kilometers. That could be extended even further if you want to exchange the reload mod for the range mod, but I don't feel that is necessary on this particular destroyer, which is the main thing that actually sets it apart from the Elbing. These guns are guns that you would want to build range into, okay, on the Schultz and on the Elbing, because the shell arcs are very flat, they don't seem to lose too much velocity at range, and the AP even maintains good penetration at long range. Even at 12, 13 kilometers, you will still pen things and you will still do damage. So buffing the range on this thing is good, especially since this destroyer is not particularly fast or maneuverable. You can almost play it a little bit like a mini cruiser with no citadel and sling AP at everything. And that's the thing that sets it apart from the Elbing, because for some reason, even though the Elbing is a tier 8 premium destroyer at this same tier as the Schultz, the base range on the Elbing's guns is an absolutely pitiful and pathetic 10.8 kilometers, which is a shame because those guns are excellent and they can function well even at ranges of 13 kilometers. In fact, that's about as far as I can get the Elbing's maximum main battery gun range with this same Eric Bay build, but also with using the range mod in the 4th slot. I can only get it to 13 kilometers. With this thing, 14.5, and that is because the base range on these guns is a much more reasonable and logical 12.4 kilometers, meaning you can actually use this destroyer at long range, which I think is what it's meant to do. So the guns really are the highlight. The AP is absolutely lethal to cruisers, as you just saw there against the Drake, which, by the way, is a heavy cruiser. 6 kilometers away, we were able to tap his citadel, I think, 6 times and deal nearly 20,000 damage to him. That is the gimmick of this entire destroyer line, is that it's very effective at citadeling cruisers. So you can get a little bit of vengeance if you're the kind of destroyer player that often finds yourself heavily countered by cruisers. In fact, you can counter them by using your better concealment to maneuver into a position where you have access to their broadside, and then you can let this AP rip and it will absolutely demolish them. Torpedoes, on the other hand, not exactly a highlight of this ship, and not quite as good as the Elbing's torpedoes. We have here 8 torpedoes set in 2 quadruple launchers. They have a 110-second reload time, which is fairly quick. The maximum damage is 15,500, and honestly, that's pretty good. And the torpedoes are stealthy, too. They've only got a 1.2 kilometer detectability by sea. The problem is the range is only 8 kilometers, which in and of itself is not terrible, but the speed on these torpedoes is a measly 52 knots. They're basically Italian sea mine torpedoes, and while they can come into play and they can be useful, they certainly are not the main source of damage here. Then the AA statistics. The aggregate AA rating for this ship is 58, which might not mean much of anything. The average DPS on all the guns, not too great, but we do have the DFAA consumable, which at least theoretically means you can defend yourself a little bit against CVs. Then for the maneuverability, we've got a top speed of 36.6 knots with that speed flag in place. Turning circle of 800 meters, so this thing is not going to be changing direction very quickly, and a rudder shift of 6.7 seconds, which is pretty slow for DD. Maneuverability is certainly not the highlight of this ship. It feels much more like what I said earlier, a mini kind of cruiser. Concealment with this mortar skill, 6.3 kilometers by sea, pretty usable. And then for the consumables, we do get an engine boost. It's just a standard one, which is nice. And then we already mentioned the DFAA consumable. We also have the smoke screen, which honestly is the worst kind of smoke screen in the game. It's the standard German one with a duration time of just over a minute, but it takes like 3 minutes to reload, so it's not good. But with the range on these guns, you can still do some open water gunboating relatively safely just because you're so far away from the other enemy ships. You don't always need to be using the smoke screen. In any case, this is a destroyer that plays much more like a mini cruiser, and its main source of damage is dealing damage with its excellent armor piercing from its 150 millimeter guns. It is a fantastically fun ship, in my opinion, much like the Elbing, which, of course, if you want to get that, it is technically free, but it's going to cost you 1.5 million GXP. Schultz, pretty much on a par with the Elbing and much easier to obtain. So if you're the kind of person that wants to get a taste of the Elbing action, you should absolutely grind to this ship. I think you'll find it well worth it, but you'll have to get out of the mindset of typical destroyer play because these are not typical destroyers. Hope you enjoyed the video. If so, give it a thumbs up, consider subscribing if you haven't already, and I'm sure we'll have more content on the Schultz coming up soon. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.